Railroads are an important part of the modern American economy, but once around 60 years ago, they could have disappeared. I will be talking about the rights and responsibilities that were supposed to bring competition and regulation to the railroads that almost put them into ruin. The U.S. railroads first started popping up in the late 1820s with the creation of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, or the B&O. Railroads slowly started expanding over the course of the U.S.'s history. They also played a main role in the supporting of troops in the Civil War, on both sides, Union and Confederate. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10, 1869, with the Central Pacific Building east from Sacramento and the Union Pacific Building west from Omaha. It was set by Congress to be 4 foot 8.5 gauge. Gauge is the width between rails. The first main standardization of the railroads came on May 31, 1886, when around 11,500 miles of rail were converted to the new standard of 4 foot 8.5 gauge. It was surprisingly finished in only 36 hours, and the Journal of Association of Engineers noted that the public hardly realized it was in progress. This is about halfway around the Earth at the equator in just 36 hours. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, was created by the Interstate Commerce Act, signed by Grover Cleveland to impose rules and regulations on the industry. By 1916, the railroads hit their peak size at around 254,000 miles of rail across the country. After World War I, other modes of transportation were becoming much more competitive with the railroads. Things such as trucks and buses, which had much fewer regulations than what the ICC was imposing on the railroads. Once World War II started, the United States wartime production was in full swing, with most of the railroads benefiting from the increased traffic. After the war, the increased production of cars and excess of military planes that were not needed could be converted to commercial use. This caused the railroads to become less profitable, with many choosing to go by car or plane. The rail passenger industry was hit hard as many railroads could not compete with the speed of the plane. The only real way for the railroads to make money off the passenger trains was their mail contract, which carried the majority of U.S. mail. By 1956, Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, which created the interstate highway system that would cross the country and spell certain doom for the railroads. As the railroads continued to lose money from stiffer competition and harsh regulations, it created a cycle in which the railroads would defer maintenance to the tracks and facilities. This made operating speeds lower and further made them less competitive with other modes of transportation. In 1968, several railroads, including the New York Central, Pennsylvania Railroad, and the New Haven Railroad, merged to create Penn Central. The three railroads only merged because they could not compete with each other in trucks and aviation. The combination of the railroads would not go well, as the mismanagement and lack of maintenance led to lots of derailments and eventually to bankruptcy. At the time, this was the single largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. The sudden collapse of Penn Central led to the government stepping in and creating two agencies: Amtrak in 1971, which absorbed most of the unprofitable passenger lines from the railroads, and Conrail in 1976, which took over many of the unprofitable rail lines in the Northeast like Penn Central and the Erie-Lackawanna. Then in 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed the Staggers Rail Act, which deregulated the industry and let the railroads become more competitive with trucking and the airlines. Many railroads started selling off their unprofitable lines to smaller companies or just abandoning them altogether. The railroads then started merging to have a greater reach and coverage, and by 1995, the Class 1s in the U.S. had been limited to only 7: NS, BNSF, Union Pacific, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern, and CSX. This act made the rates cheaper, revenue, productivity, and volume of freight increased in the railroad industry. Over the years, the railroads have been forced to do many things, from creating workers' rights to regulations placed on them by the ICC. The first main regulation of the railroad was in 1863 when Congress first decided that the rail gauge of the new Transcontinental Railroad was to be 4 foot 8 and 1/2 inches. Later in 1887, the ICC was signed into law by the Interstate Commerce Act to impose rules and regulations on the future railroads. They would set the rates on what the railroads carries, with bulk items like coal or iron being cheaper and other items being more expensive. In 1893, the knuckle coupler was mandated to be used along with driver brakes and automatic air systems. The knuckle coupler improved safety as prior systems like the Lincoln pin or couplers were extremely dangerous. The automatic air brakes helped, as before a brakeman would have to run up and down the train to apply handbrakes to go down any hill. In 1966, roof rocks were banned from rail cars, so any new rail car that was built could not have roof rocks. They pose danger to anybody on them. If they're on a moving train, they could fall, or if they're in mountainous terrain and weren't paying attention, they could be hit by a tunnel. Depending on the speed, fall off or the train or get knocked out. The ICC was the main governing body that set the regulation and rules of the railroads. Any railroad would have to go through them to get rid of any unprofitable line. Most of the time, the ICC would make the rates of the railroad shipments way off of what the market value would be. The railroads getting undercut, as the ICC did not base their mandated rates on what they should have. If they wanted to get rid of some of their passenger lines, it would need to be approved by the ICC. And if they deemed it to be valuable to the people, even if barely used, it could not be canceled. The ICC made it very hard to change or get rid of some of their lines. Many railroads were denied a way to give up their passenger lines, which were losing lots of money. The only way the railroads could get any money was from their contract with the U.S. Postal Service, which existed primarily up until the 1970s, but that only really existed on their long-distance routes. The railroads were finally allowed to give up their intercity passenger routes to Amtrak in 1971, or operate them for several years longer. Most gave up their trains as they were mostly losing money, but some kept their services, like the DNRTW or the Southern Railway, with the Southern eventually joining in 1979. In 1976, Conrail was formed by the government to help aid the absence of northeastern railroads, as many of them were going bankrupt. The rights and regulations of the roads are important for safety, but hurt the industry. The more that they are regulated, the more they will hurt with other forms of competition, with them being mandated to carry passengers for many railroads or having unfair rates. If the railroad shut down or went bankrupt, many things would have to be different. The main transporter of all things bulk, cars, coal, container, grain, etc., will have to be transported by truck. This means there are thousands more trucks on the road, with lots more pollution. An average train can hold up to 240 containers. 240 trucks would be needed to replace that. The railroads nowadays carry around 28% of all cargo in the U.S. Rail would most likely not die, but if the Staggers Rail Act had not passed, a majority of rail lines would have gone bankrupt from the ICC not keeping fair rates. There isn't much of a counterview against the deregulation of the railroad industry, other than the increased competition between airlines and trucking companies. The railroad helps almost everyone, as it is environmentally good for the world, as they can carry much more than a plane or truck. For the passenger industry, they had to rely on governments to provide public transportation rather than the private companies between cities, and often is not funded enough to be optimal for transportation. Many regulations are good for the railroads, or at least the workers, as it is the safest it has ever been, and is the number one transporter of cargo across the nation. The efficiency of the railroads is much higher than what they were in the 1950s and 60s. The regulations may have hurt the railroading industry, but has greatly improved with it getting greener and better for the earth. The transportation has gotten faster, more effective for both goods and people. The network has evolved into one of the best freight systems and most reliant worldwide, although the passenger network suffers because of this.